Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 6 of the Fujitsu Impact series, Driving AI for Real Business Outcomes. So across this season, we've explored how organizations adopt AI, secure it, orchestrate it, and govern it. And today, we close season 1 with the question that leaders everywhere are asking. Is your AI delivering real value or just activity? Because deploying AI is no longer the challenge. Realizing value from it consistently, measurably, and at scale, that's where organizations struggle. So today, our discussion is all about AI value realization. What is it, and how organizations can finally ensure AI delivers durable, monetizable business impact that truly moves the needle for your business. So joining me today are two leaders who live this topic every day. First, we have Kartik Raval, Head of Business Value for Fujitsu Consulting Americas, bringing a perspective grounded in ROI, readiness, and value realization. And also with us, Stephanie Krishnan, Associate Vice President for Manufacturing and Energy at IDC APAC, one of the sharpest market voices in manufacturing and energy transformation. So thank you both for being here. Let's dive right in. All right, so
Thanks.
There's a myth that if you implement AI, you actually deliver AI value. But what is defined as value? So Stephanie, let's start with you. IDC predicts that by 2027, 50% of CXOs will create enterprise AI value playbooks. So how does IDC define value, and why is AI value realization so much more than financial ROI?
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks for having me. And you're absolutely right. AI value is not proven when a model goes live or when a pilot looks promising. IDC frames the value as outcomes leaders can operationalize and defend, right? Looking at improved quality, process performance, decision speed, and financial ROI is only one dimension of that. The practical failure mode is that organizations skip the baseline and then reach the end of a project and argue on some esoteric, rough feeling sense of whether it helped, which often collapses into a narrow cost conversation because the other goals were never set. So value realization is about measurement discipline plus decision discipline. First, be explicit about the metrics that will declare success and lock them in before deployment. And also measure movement from baseline to target and use that evidence to decide whether to continue, to pivot, or scale. So I think, when we look at this, we can split this into IT and line of business. With IT, we need to think about governance and data readiness and how we're going to prepare for that. And the baseline conversation quickly becomes one of whether source data exists and when it does not, and what benchmarks to use and what stakeholders will agree to. And then when we get operationally, we need to think about, other metrics such as competency for new hires or safety culture metrics or customer related metrics, not just the ROI conversation. So there's a number of things that come into that. It's not an easy, here point to one thing and you've got value, but it's certainly something organizations need to weigh up.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks, Stephanie. So Kartik, let me bring you in here. Because this belief that AI automatically equals value can be dangerous. Why is this belief so misleading, and what's actually preventing companies from realizing value even after deployment? What are you seeing with your customers?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Carlos. Just complimenting what Stephanie said a little bit earlier, what we're finding is that most companies do a really good job of defining the value hypothesis or defining it at all. I mean, starting with your basic blocking and tackling, like baseline values and baseline data. Even before that, identifying the KPIs that are material to the business that are going to be most impacted by an AI investment. So no validated source data. They end up with a lot of churn and activity, but they never achieve the kind of outcomes that should have been identified in the very beginning. Now, some of the big blockers I see that are out there, you might have a business case, if at all developed, weak or overly optimistic. We talked about the missing baseline and target values. And it's not to the exclusion of other dimensions like business process, your data foundation, your organizational readiness dimensions. All those need to be factored in. And moreover, I'm seeing financial officers stopping the blank check spending on AI. They are now getting more rigorous and requiring evidence. And anecdotally, there was a global electronics company in the public domain information. They ran 12 AI pilots, and they couldn't prove $1 of value across 12 AI pilots. Huge investment.
Mhm.
They never established their KPI, the baseline or source data, and that prompted a full stop on their AI endeavors. Just as an example.
Right. Oh, thanks, Kartik. All right. So we saw what a bad example looks like. So let's make this concrete. Can you give us a customer example of what defining value correctly actually looks like?
Yeah, one of our clients, Panasonic, a well-known global electronics manufacturer, did incredibly well. They took the time and they aligned up front on the KPIs. They knew that in the areas that they were working on from an AI perspective, that forecast accuracy and associated bias were critical. On the inventory management side, the turns and accuracy of inventory were all key KPIs that they wanted to track. But moreover, they established the source systems for their baseline data, cleared that, validated it. They established targets, values that were achievable and measurable, and they ensured that there was clear accountability. Because this approach around value was so well defined up front, they were able to quickly deploy, govern the rollout and operationalization, and they were able to achieve multi-million-dollar annual savings by taking this approach. So it can be done, but the majority of the companies that are out there just don't take a systematic, rigorous approach on the front end, and then they're challenged on the back end.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's really powerful, and it's clear that it shows how defining value up front changes everything. So Stephanie, let's expand this into the industry view. So manufacturers especially feel the pressure to get AI right. So throughput, energy, quality, the stakes are high. Why is value realization so critical for manufacturers and ops teams? And can you give us an industry example of what this looks like in practice?
Yeah, so I totally agree, Carlos. Value realization is especially critical because when you look at manufacturing and operations, the margin for error is very low and variability is very expensive. So AI only becomes durable when the value drives visible, repeatable, movement in operational outcomes. Kartik was talking about KPIs, and we mentioned it before as having that baseline. It is so necessary. It's not just when it's having those outcomes. It's not just about having those outcomes when it's first deployed. It needs to be continual. It cannot show, if you can't show what changed on the line, you can't show what changed in maintenance or in planning, you will not get sustained adoption or funding to take that to scale. So in practice, the strongest programs that translate AI, translate AI into a short list of plant floor and supply chain outcomes, right? And then review them like any other ops initiative, right? Make sure that you're looking at throughput, defect rates, quality consistency. And what this looks like in practice is less about one big ROI story and more about repeatable, operator relevant wins, thinking about things like quality. If you look at early anomaly detection that reduces the scrap or the rework and stabilizes that first pass yield. Thinking about performance where you have fewer micro stoppages and smoother flow that lifts throughput without adding headcount. And then thinking also about consistency across sites, common KPI definitions and governance across the site so that good means the same thing everywhere. And this matters as automation rises and the workforce mix changes across regions. Mm-hmm. So one other practical pattern I want to highlight is data ownership. Organizations seeing faster time to value are the ones where the operational teams closest to the data take ownership, keeping it clean, defining access, and making it usable and actionable. Because if you want to succeed, you need to think about who has access to the data, what does the data look like, is it clean, and then you can pick your 3 to 5 operational KPIs, baseline them, assign joint ops IT owners, run governance loops, and then scale or stop depending on the measured movement.
Right. And thanks, Stephanie. So that was very clear. So Kartik, let's connect this to scaling. You mentioned this earlier, that the idea that value is what unlocks reinvestment. So how does value realization influence reinvestment decisions, and how does the AI flywheel come into play?
Carlos, I shared with you a little bit earlier the checkpoints that financial officers are now putting in place, those quarterly no-go checkpoints. And we all know capital is becoming more and more scarce as we go forward. So it's really not much of an option, despite initial CapEx requirements. Ultimately, AI programs must strive towards self-funding in order for them to get that flywheel spinning. And more importantly, if it's not the ask now of officers in the company, it soon will be within most organizations. Also worth mentioning is that scaling costs are sometimes linear. They don't achieve the economies of scale that sometimes are expected. And that might be due to a lack of proper readiness. Moreover, the benefits may not be exponential either. It may take a little bit of time to assess the technology and give it time for adoption and refinement.
Okay. All right. So we know why it matters. We know the pitfalls. So let's talk about where leaders actually begin. So Kartik, what's a starting point for organizations that want to realize value from AI?
I mentioned earlier the need for financial rigor, but it doesn't start just there. There's several other key dimensions that you need to look at and ensure readiness, and that'll help you begin the journey. Before I cover those dimensions, I would just like to put out there that we've seen pilots succeed, but just with the low level of readiness, that doesn't often translate to enterprise value. So with that said, let's take a look at those three dimensions. The first one being business process readiness. You want to make sure your processes are standardized. There's also an assumption that that standardization is in place, seldom the case. So business processes need to be beyond just standardized, observable, and there has to be good governance around it. Now let's look at the people side of dimensions. Organizational readiness. You have to have the skills in place. You have to establish trust and acceptance of the new ways of working by your team members. And then more importantly, leadership needs to be aligned. They really have to be behind this and in order to ensure that adoption takes place. Now, the last dimension, data, is what I consider to be the most key. Stephanie highlighted the need for data accuracy, availability, and good governance. And I would often argue that this dimension is a showstopper. I'll give you a great example. There was a discrete manufacturer that tried to scale an AI planning agent off of one single plant and associated operating model. They wanted to scale across 22 plants, huge project and quite ambitious. Well, it turns out that every plant defines the capability with the same label, but the underlying processes, the data, and tech were very different from the reference model. And when they tried to roll out, their scaling costs went geometric. So they had to reset, step back, and standardize at least a dozen of their core processes, at which time they were able to accelerate their deployment from a 30-week to an 8-week tranche. So this is just another instance of an organization that did step back. They looked at these dimensions and they were able to succeed by going forward. Had they considered these much earlier on, they wouldn't have had the reset. And again, those benefits would have been realized much sooner than they had expected.
Really exciting example. So Stephanie, I want to bring in the IDC lens on this. Does what Kartik described align with what IDC is seeing? Where does IDC believe leaders should start?
Yeah, the readiness framing is right? Looking at the KPIs, bringing it back to process readiness and data readiness. But I just want to spend a little bit of time on the organizational readiness layer, because it's where many manufacturers stall, specifically with change management, skills, how work gets redesigned when employees manage agents or when they're dealing with AI output. And when that becomes real, it really does change the way that people work. In the market, clients I'm talking to assume AI can drop into the old organization unchanged, and then adoption lags. Adoption of the AI lags because job scopes, decision rights, and HR readiness were never addressed. In IDC's 2025 Digital Executive Sentiment Survey, we saw this reinforced. In global manufacturing responses, only 18% say they can access the required digital skills with no negative impact, while 35% report some skills gap and another 27% say that they struggle to find the right skills in a timely way. Now, this is actually having an impact on projects. And in the same survey, we saw that 58% of those respondents were reporting that projects were slipping 3 to 12 months due to skills shortages. And almost 20% said that there was a 12 to 18 month delay. So this is a readiness tax, if you like. The most transformation timelines have not priced in. So when we think about where leaders should start with this, the data ownership, looking at the operating model clarity, making sure that the teams closest to the data, as I said before, take ownership, but also take ownership of not just the data, the process changes, and make AI use actionable, making sure they're able to use it, and then it builds trust, and then time to value, and then making sure that they fund the human side deliberately. Training, change enablement, role redesign, using value playbooks to close gaps and standardize how they scale.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And building on that, Stephanie, IDC does a lot of sector level benchmarking. Which industries are leading the way in value realization, and what's driving their success?
It's a little bit of a mixed report card. We have some data that shows that across global respondents, I've just picked out supply chain productivity uplift, and it varies materially by industry. We've got here the blue indicates those that have reported greater than 10% uplift in people productivity. And you can see automotive here is highest at 20%, with the rest at around the 7-11% range. Now, interestingly, though, this is not a consistent thing, or you can't consistently say that this is AI all over the place. It does, when we look at the process and the operational benefits, they actually differ. So when you look at root cause analysis and continuous monitoring, that tends to be something that is a benefit for process manufacturing, whereas we see discrete manufacturing seeing benefits in things like operational risk management and operations design and innovation. So AI's value can be uneven. Productivity uplift differs by sector, and benefits concentrate in specific processes. Again, oil and gas, we see prioritizing operational risk, asset performance, and R&D and engineering intensity, because that's where a lot of the money is spent, is actually in designing and dealing with the initial, oil extraction and well design. So there's a lot of investment there. Now, it also reflects the value targets that leaders set, right? Organizations that anchor AI to engineering cycle time or exception response speed will instrument different workflows than those targeting, say, inventory turns or customer service stability. So AI tends to concentrate, or AI's value tends to concentrate where leaders measure success, and where they're actually applying the metrics that we talked about earlier. And that's why two companies in the same sector can report very different results. So while we are seeing some trends, it tends to be a very mixed bag.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Stephanie. All right, so now we've defined value. We've talked readiness. Let's now connect the dots. So, Kartik, once readiness is in place, what's the process organizations should follow to make sure that value is actually delivered?
Great question, Carlos. We found that it hinges on one word, and that's traceability. Fujitsu's developed a unique method to model benefits called results chain. Basically, what results chain allows you to do is establish the traceability necessary to drive value realization, where we start out with the initiative, the intermediate outcome, and associated capabilities and intermediate outcomes that need to be achieved. Those in turn are tied all the way to the strategic outcomes, and identify where the monetization opportunities might be. This approach allows us to have full line of sight from an AI investment all the way to the KPIs that are critical to the business. And it begins to allow us to show the cause and effect relationship between a business capability and the KPIs that it's impacting. If it's not in place today, then you won't even know if your AI initiative is actually impacting the organization from a performance perspective. I mean, fundamentally, if you can't trace it, you can't measure it. If you can't measure it, you can't scale it. So the modeling method really allows us to very clearly articulate where the IT investment is producing value. It also allows us to make adjustments at the business capability level and underlying AI investment, so that we can pivot our investments if the KPIs are not being impacted from the target values that we have established originally.
Okay, thanks, Kartik. So Stephanie, feel free to comment on that. So IDC talks about traceability and the shift to agent-driven workflows. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so that results chain approach really matters because of that traceability, and it's where many AI programs break down at scale. It makes explicit what is changing in the operation, who owns it each step, and which KPIs will improve impact. And it needs to include the qualitative measures like workforce adoption, time to competency, and safety behaviors. Now, this is where we see the market heading in 2026 and beyond. Many organizations are moving from those commoditized standalone Gen AI tasks that you can see here, thinking about summarization, transcription. They're useful, but they're table stakes, right? Organizations are then moving towards integrated agent-enabled workflows embedded in functions and industry processes. So the results chain that Kartik has talked about and methodologies like it clarify why those maturity steps matter. Generic productivity use cases often stop early. The output is content or it's task completion, and the link to operational outcomes and measurable value is indirect because it depends on whether people change decisions or they change the way that they execute. When we're looking at the functional and process use cases, it pushes outputs into defined workflows so that the output becomes a decision signal or action, looking at, say, for example, root cause recommendations or guided shift handovers that can be tied to measurable operational outcomes. So when we're looking at going from productivity to functional and then into industry specific use cases, that extends the chain to end, right, across systems and sites, where we're able to coordinate actions and drive sustained KPI movement, which makes the value more defensible and easier to scale. So that's why once agents start orchestrating decisions across data and systems, a clear line of sight from inputs to outcomes and from outcomes to leadership decisions becomes not negotiable.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Stephanie. So that was very clear. All right, so now let's bring this home with the question that leaders ask us the most. Kartik, how should organizations measure value? What's Fujitsu's recommendation?
Yeah, so we use an artifact known as a benefits register, and that benefits register has several key attributes. One is what is a targeted business outcome we're seeking to achieve, the associated KPIs, the measurement methods, the frequency of measurement of our baseline values and our target values, which ones are monetizable, who owns the benefit, accountability-wise, and then what's the benefit realization trajectory or the timeline. Oftentimes, an AI agent may not be able to deliver value at 100%. It may only be 25 or 50%, but we want to account for the roll-up and ramp-up of that. Now, this benefits register and associated attributes then becomes the source for dashboard views for the various persona. Stephanie mentioned that you have personas at an operational level, the folks on the plant floor that need to have certain KPIs and data, whereas aggregated monetizable benefits may be consumed by executive leaders in terms of impact to the business. So it's this concept of a benefits register and associated data is what you'd want to start out with as an example for measurement and monitoring and management of value as you go forward. That also allows you to determine, is an agent effective in moving the needle? If not, redeploy to your investments to another agent or make modifications on that agent. Now, what I would like to add, and this is currently almost a manual step. You have APIs integrating the source systems. If you don't have source systems to provide that source data or baseline data, it might be a manual step. I see the future evolving into a very exciting realm, what I call value realization 2.0, where agents will actually automatically collect the KPI source data, analyze it against the target values, validate the source data, detect any anomalies, and generate what we call value drift alerts. If it's outside of the tolerances we've established for achieving target values, it'll generate these alerts and associated insights near real time. So I see this evolving. We see some organizations beginning to move into this direction.
Okay, thank you. So that's fantastic. Thank you, Kartik. So Stephanie, IDC works closely with CXOs designing value playbooks. What guidance does IDC give leaders building an AI value playbook?
Yeah, so I think as Kartik's talked to and we've highlighted, is the most reliable way to avoid pilot theater and move to value is to work backwards from those outcomes, right? Lock the prerequisites, lock the owners, lock the baselines. What I would add for CXOs in building an AI value playbook is to treat measurement as a portfolio discipline, not only a dashboard exercise, and that's why I love the idea of this results. Having that results register. I think that's really important in making sure that it doesn't stop at that dashboard. So when we're looking at how we take it forward, is being able to have those organizational readiness measures as a first-class metric as well, because they're leading indicators of whether value will stick, right? Looking at adoption and usage by role, training completion, time to competency, simple trust or confidence signals from supervisors and operators. And then thinking about making governance a continuous feedback loop. Every metric should answer what does this decision enable? And the cadence should force decisions, right? Look, scale, pivot, pause, or retire. When looking at the success of these, measurement has to be tied to the KPIs. Those KPIs need to reflect success, and then it allows leaders to decide when they stop debating value and start managing it, and therefore deciding whether projects are successful or not.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Stephanie. All right. So now let's have a little fun with a quick lightning round of true or false. So I'll make a statement, and I'd like you both to just come out and yell true or false. Ready? Here we go. True or false? If you implement AI, you automatically realize value.
False.
False.
False. All right. True or false? Organizational readiness is optional.
Not an
False.
option. False.
Yeah.
False. All right. Yep. It's often the difference
Absolutely.
between success and failure. All right.
Absolutely.
And true or false? Value realization happens quickly once AI is deployed.
False.
Although there are times, there are exceptions. Maybe 1% of the time, there are companies that get it right out of the gate. Let's qualify that and ensure we recognize those high-performing companies that are out there.
But it does require proper planning, right? It does make sure, the necessary, checkpoints need to be put in, the baseline needs to be measured, and they need to be able to track that success.
So there are 2% of those organizations that get it right out of the gate.
Right.
For sure.
So we can agree then that it requires proper planning and multiple checkpoints.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Wonderful. All right. So let's wrap this up with your 3-point AI value realization blueprint, the essentials leaders should walk away with today. So number 1, value is designed, not discovered. AI doesn't create value by existing. You define it up front, you baseline it, you measure it, and you don't assume it shows. Number 2, readiness determines results. If your people, processes, and data aren't ready, AI won't deliver, even if the tech works. And number 3, use dashboards for near real-time visibility. AI agents should feed insights into those dashboards, helping you justify reinvestment and scale that works, leading to sustained, durable outcomes. All right. And that brings us to the end of episode 6 and the end of season 1 of the Fujitsu Impact series. So across these episodes, a truth became clear. Leaders are done with the AI hype. They want outcomes, clarity, and a real path forward. And you've been right here with us, pushing the conversation and challenging the status quo. All right, so if you want to go deeper into the topics we covered, please scan the QR code that's about to come on screen now. There it is. Or click the link below for all the episodes where you'll be able to see all the episodes. You'll have links to more IDC insights, demos, and ways to connect with our team. So a huge thank you to Kartik and Stephanie for joining us today, as well as all of our speakers across the entire series, and to the team behind the scenes, and of course, to the wonderful audience joining us and keeping the momentum going. All right, so we're not done yet. Our broadcast is about to end, but our speakers are sticking around for the next 20 minutes to answer all of your questions. So drop them in the comments section now. And season 2 is already in motion, and we're raising the bar even higher. So until then, keep driving AI towards real, measurable, human-centered business outcomes. All right, thanks for being part of the journey, and we'll see you next season. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.